Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob Acquire. And Monday, we touched on the Panthers draft class, specifically risers and fallers in terms of individual prospects. But today, we get to really unravel, I think, the vision and process or lack thereof for several different teams across the league. And I think it's good to start with the positives and the draft class that really stood out to me that really embodied like my thought process when looking at this class was taking a guy like Walter Nolan in the first, grabbing a guy like Jordan Birch in the second, and grabbing a value piece in the second round. And sure enough, that's exactly what the Arizona Cardinals did. And Monty Ossenfort, I think, really similarly to what Brian Flores is doing in Minnesota, where it's reinforcing the trenches, but it's going, okay, we can't get pushed around. We cannot be the ones getting bullied. We're going to start doing some of that bullying ourselves. And I thought that was the identity shift for the Cardinals this offseason. And I absolutely love it. There is a lot to like about what they did in free agency and then the draft. And I think it just meshes well. You see the vision that they're building in Arizona. It's just a matter of whether or not it comes together fast enough so that Gannon and Monty Ossenfort can watch it kind of flourish.
For sure, right? When we're talking about drafts that we liked, draft grades as a whole, the Cardinals are probably my favorite. They had my number 5 player in Walter Nolan in this class, number 6 in Will Johnson. Jordan Birch was a top 100 player for me, and he goes in round 3. Really good class. And then when you combine that with the free agency stuff they do, right, like Josh Sweat, Dalvin Tomlinson, they before last
Calais
year,
Campbell.
Calais
you talk about a
back in
Arizona.
Presence. Yeah. Before the trade deadline last year, trading for and then extending Barrett Browning, the outside linebacker.
Mm-hmm.
And then they still have guys like Darius Robinson, who's going to start this year, former first-round pick, B.J. Ojulari, former second-round pick. All of those guys on the defensive front completely retooled. For sure, my favorite in the class. And then probably 2 and 3 would be Panthers and Patriots. I'm trying not to be a homer, but like I said on Tuesday, I'm excited about this class. But the Cardinals, they let value come to them. They didn't move around or like get too trade happy or like didn't give up future value, right? They let the board fall to them, got a lot of good players. I think that their defense will be better off for it. Looking back at last year, at last year's opening week or opening game, I should say, 8 of their 11 starters from that game will be replaced this year. And a lot of those starters will be in backup roles or even in third string roles. And that just goes to show you how much they've invested into the defense and how they want to play complementary football this year.
The Panthers and Patriots, I love that you brought those two teams up because I think they fit in the same bubble and sphere as the Arizona Cardinals. These are teams that are trying to build a culture, build an identity. However, I think a lot of the teams that we're going to talk about in this section in particular are teams that actually stay true to their identities. The teams that are, I would say, the bar setters in the league in terms of roster building. And the team that I really think stole the draft from picking so late in each round was actually the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, the fact that you walk away with a guy like Josh Simmons, you get guys on the defensive line. Why I think their production is a little bit questionable when you compare them behind Chris Jones, George Karlaftis, and some of these other defensive linemen and allow them to develop. There's no rush with Omar Norman-Lott or Ashton Gallotti. And then Noel Williams, Jalen Royals. Those are guys that I think have functional roles within Andy Reid and Steve Spagnuolo's systems. And it's great to see how it all came together for them. And I think it's going to work out as they kind of retool from their Super Bowl loss.
Definitely staying true to the idea of spending early capital on a tackle, right? They've done it the past couple years, hasn't worked out for them, so hopefully Simmons can work out for them this time. I think when we did our mock drafts, our 32-team mock drafts before, or it was on draft day, if I recall correctly, I had them taking Simmons, but in a trade up, and it being like, all right, it's finally going to work out for them if they take this guy. That's kind of what I'm hoping for now. That's kind of what they're hoping for, right? If they're willing to take him in the first round. And the other guys, like you talked about, Norman-Lott, his production is questionable to say the least. He had like 150 pass rushing snaps, but his pressure rate is through the roof. If you extrapolate his rate to a full season, he's probably the best player of all time. But unfortunately, that's the questionable part. He didn't defend the run or anything. So being in a rotation, I think will be good for him. Gelati, the defensive end from Louisville, I think is good depth. And then the other guys you talked about, like Noel Williams from Cal, corner depth, right? I said corner is a sneaky need for them because they kind of got cooked in the Super Bowl. And then Jalen Royals just adds another explosive receiver to the room. Maybe some insurance for Rashee Rice or Hollywood Brown. They did re-sign Hollywood Brown, but he didn't play much of any of last season. I didn't think he played the regular season at all. I think he was back for the playoffs. Just good reinforcement there. And then good identifying that they have to solve this left tackle thing if they want to be back. I want to say competitive again, but they were just in the Super Bowl. If they want to win it again, they're going to need to solve the left tackle spot.
It seems like they've been reshuffling and trying to find an answer at that spot since trading for Orlando Brown from the Baltimore Ravens. I mean, that was years ago, and it just feels like they keep going through these 1-year rentals, like you said, throwing draft picks at it. And hopefully, I think if Josh Simmons is able to stay healthy, he'll be the answer long-term at that position. It's just a matter of how does that injury impact him? Is there a transition period with him going from college to the pros? But Jalen Royals, to your point, he comps a little bit more like a Rashee Rice with a pretty much, I would say, looming suspension now that he'll be coming off his tear and then his legal incidents last offseason. I think he'll be a really good fit in that offense and be able to pair nicely with what they already have conceptually there. Another team that I think stayed true to who they were in the draft, and they didn't panic when they didn't get their guy. And apparently Tetero McMillan was the dream pick for the Dallas Cowboys at 12. Unfortunately, Panthers took him 4 spots before at pick 8. And so they took the next best guy on their board, and that was Tyler Booker. And I think that really solidifies the inside of their offensive line in ways that I think helps them get back on track. And I think we talked about that a little bit on Tuesday, but I really like them going back to the well in the second round, getting Donovan Ezaruko, the pair behind Dante Fowler, and offer another edge rusher besides Micah Parsons, especially with the departure of DeMarcus Lawrence. So this just seems to be a team that's on top of it. Siobhan Ravel was another pick they had in the 3rd round, and he'll pair very nicely in that secondary. There's just a lot to like outside of them, obviously getting a pass catcher. But I think we'll talk about teams that really didn't address the pass catcher need a little bit later on, especially considering Brandon Beane's comments earlier in the week on a Buffalo Bills radio. But what are your thoughts about the Dallas Cowboys? It seems like Will McClay really is locked in year after year. And the Cowboys, it feels like they need 4 or 5 starters every year out of the draft, and they get them. So I don't think much is going to change in that department this year, especially with the guys they were able to get.
Yeah, I like what they did. We talked about how important getting Booker was on Tuesday. I can't hate that. He's like the only, if you count Gray Zabel as a guard, maybe him as well, but like the only startable, immediate starting guards. Ezeraku, he's not a plus athlete, but he's very technical. It doesn't have to be a plus athlete if you have Micah Parsons on the other side, right? Then Ravel, we talked about, really good corner. And I think Jaden Blue, I think he's probably going to get the lion's share of the carries, the running back from Texas. And then getting a linebacker as well. Cowboys need linebackers every year. So just getting one for the depth and the guy from Florida, Shamar James, I think that's going to be good for him this year. And staying true to who they are, they don't reach for anything. They don't panic. Even though they said that they were going to get Dak a receiver, that was like their entire message. Maybe they aren't true to what they say to the media in the offseason, but once the draft rolls around, they're always true to, all right, let's get some trenches, let's rebuild offense and defensive lines and work from there.
What's interesting is, yes, they said they would attack that position, but it's like you traded a 4th mid-season last year for Jonathan Mingo. You used believe a top 100 pick on Jalen Tolbert like 3 or 4 years ago. You're hoping some of that materializes, but it probably won't. So again, going into 2025, you're relying on CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson as being your top 2 pass catchers within that offense. So we'll see what Brian Schottenheimer whips up. But another team that really does allow the draft to come to them. I think that's really been their strength since, I believe it was the 2021 draft when the Eagles selected Jalen Reagor over Justin Jefferson. And actually, no, that was 2020 because I think 2021, Devontae Smith was the pick for the Eagles. So back in 2020, They picked Jalen Reagor. That was a little bit of a reach. Obviously, above Justin Jefferson is the big like, you did what? And obviously, the facial reactions from the Vikings front office are recorded and are very funny to look at when they pop up on the timeline. But going back to the Eagles' process since then is that they allow the draft to come to them. They aren't reaching for players, and we've seen in instances teams like them and the Ravens really collect a lot of talent by just selecting the best player available at their spot. And so when you see them get a guy like Jahad Campbell in the first round, and then Andrew Mabuko in the second, you get Small Munden, another Georgia player on day 3, who his athleticism is off the charts. Kirby Smart has spoken about him in regards to being one of the most athletic players he's ever coached. And that says a lot considering the guys that have come out of that school. So when you look at what the Eagles did, it's just that they stay true to who they are, and then they end up in the Super Bowl, in the playoffs, year after year. And it's to a testament of how they fundamentally go about building the roster.
I think staying true to what the Eagles are makes a lot of sense when they already have such a good and deep roster, right? Especially on defense. They can just take whoever's left. Obviously, this year they swapped picks with the Chiefs for like a 4th rounder or something to go get Jahad Campbell, who was probably a top 10, 12 player on the board, who had fallen because he's a linebacker, because he's going to have shoulder surgery. They get Makuba, the safety, in the 2nd round, who fell because he's a little bit slight of frame, but probably, other than Starks, the only rangy safety in this draft. Then a lot of guys on day 3. Ty Robinson, the defensive tackle from Nebraska. I think it's going to be like not a 1-for-1 Milton Williams replacement, but he's going to have some good pass rush chops. Smile Munden, like you mentioned. Cameron Williams, the right tackle from Texas, who had a down year, but coming into the year, people talked about him like he was a top 50 pick. So they just always find the Virginia Tech edge, who had 15.5 sacks. They got him in the late 6th round. So they always find good value. It's just because they already have such a good team. So they're able to do stuff like that. You talked about the Ravens too. They're able to take a safety at pick 27 just because their team's already so good. And that's just how the rich stay rich. They don't reach for players. They already have infrastructure in place, so they can add a good non-premium position that can have an impact. Like, I think Saquon's the perfect example in that regard with the Eagles.
Mm-hmm. And they know when to go out and spend money. Like they retained Zach Bond this past offseason because he was a star in their offense. And you get the pair a guy like Jahad Campbell next to him, like that's going to be insane from like an athleticism standpoint, what you're going to be able to do down in and down out. So I think it gives them a whole lot of options on that front. And we've seen now back-to-back drafts where the Eagles are addressing kind of the second level. They've invested so much in the defensive line in the trenches, and they will probably start going back to that in the next year or two, but that's what's freed them up to now invest in other holes or areas on their roster by taking the best player available. So again, it's hard to fault the Eagles for this because they've put themselves in this position, but it's a situation where the rich keep getting richer. The last team we want to talk about that had a clear vision, stayed true to who they were, it really is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Like they have an identity and have had an identity for, it feels like 50, 60 years now. And it's just play defense and run the ball. And the fact that you're able to get your Cam Hayward replacement at pick 21, you don't have to move up or down, play any funny games. You're able to get that guy in Derek Harmon and then come back in round 3 and get, I believe, and we talked about this when we talked about the running backs, probably one of the most patient running backs we've seen since Le'Veon Bell and Caleb Johnson, who I think is going to pair really well in that Arthur Smith offense. And that, to me, that's a Steelers draft. That's we're going to win in the trenches. We're going to play defense, and we're going to run the ball, and we're going to play a smash mouth brand of football that a lot of teams are going to struggle to kind of keep up with. So we'll see what happens with their quarterback situation. That's obviously going to be a topic of discussion for us moving forward. But again, when we talk about a draft that kind of stayed true to a team's identity, this felt like a Steelers draft.
Yeah, not reaching on a QB, right? They learned the lesson with Kenny Pickett. If there's not a first round graded QB on the board at that point, maybe don't take one at all. They took Will Howard in the 6th round, but that's a much better value, I think, than taking Shedeur Sanders, Jalen Milroe, or even Jackson Dart with the 21st pick. their vision as well was also to take Big Ten players. Of their 7
Mhm.
draft picks, 6 of them are Big Ten. A couple years ago, it would be only 4 of them, but since Oregon and Washington joined, which it feels disgusting to say, but they have 6 Big Ten players because Derek Harmon from Oregon and Carson Burner from Washington.
And the two Ohio State players that you talked about, Jack Sawyer and Will Howard, those are high character guys that I think really are going to bring a locker room presence to the Steelers, whether or not we really see them on the field. These are guys that are going to be pushing everybody else in practice on and off the field. And you love to see that. Again, that's what makes this such a Steelers draft, is just through and through with the players, with the positions addressed. And again, there are still holes on this roster. It just, this team hasn't really deviated from its core principles over the past like 50 years, which is just insane to think about from a NFL standpoint, team building process. But that means that we're now talking about teams that have a lot of hope, that stick to who they are able to continually keep a winning culture, to teams that came across a little desperate, reached maybe a little bit for either players or positions instead of allowing the draft to come to them. And I think that's really what separates the good teams from the bad teams. And that's kind of what Richard Thaler and Kate Massey tried to get at with the loser's curse several years ago with the analytics paper in the draft, is that you have these teams that feel like they're almost pigeonholed, or they have tunnel vision on a certain prospect, and they throw out all process. And I think it doesn't bite you in the moment. This is something that ends up biting you several years down the road when you are trying to either pivot or rebuild.
Yeah, it's Vontae Mack no matter what. But maybe like a more real life version. Teams have to get this position in the draft. And usually it's bad teams, right, that have positioned themselves poorly to where we need an O lineman, we need a corner or something of that effect. With the first team, we'll talk about the Dolphins. We need O linemen, right? They haven't had an O lineman. They took Patrick Paul in the second last year, but they still need a lot of O-line help. And they didn't take one in the first round this year because they went with Kenneth Grant. I think you predicted that one in our 32 team mock when we did it last week, but they got him at pick 13, nose tackle, who has some upside. They got Jonah Savanaia from Arizona in the second round, an interior offensive guy. Then they didn't pick again for 106 picks. So between pick 37 and pick 143, nothing, because they had to trade up into the second round for the guard from Arizona. So when you look at it that way, 2 premium players, and only one of them is on the offensive line that they need. I think they still could have gone receiver. They didn't take one. They took a quarterback in the 7th round. Tua has health concerns and staying on the field concerns. And I really think they could have attacked O-line more, but they couldn't because they only had that few early capital that they had.
They went all in a couple off seasons ago, and now it's time to pay your dues. Obviously, Chris Greer has been on record saying, hey, we're shopping Jalen Ramsey. He's probably not going to be on the roster. That's creating holes in the secondary. That's why a lot of people had Will Johnson going to the Miami Dolphins. Kenneth Grant, if you look at their defensive line, outside of Zach Seiler on the inside, there was really nobody there. Like, their nose tackle was a practice squad like level guy, like an undrafted dude. And so getting Kenneth Grant at least raises the floor there, but he had his issues as a prospect. So you're wondering if he's going to kind of flounder a little bit as a rookie. And then, yes, the offensive lineman that they reached for out of Arizona, he played tackle last year and definitely did not look good and out of position at the left tackle spot. But moving him in at guard, like, yes, from a Chris Greer standpoint, he was the guy that drafted Robert Hunt. This is another big physical guard that'll move people. Yeah. But at the same time, there are still elements of his game that need to be worked on. And so that's going to create issues that they may come in and be day one starters, but they're going to have flaws in their game. But you had to take these players because otherwise you're dealing with practice squad level replacement. And that's just, you can't roll that out on Sundays and expect to win football games. And when this is a team with all the talent that they sold out for, struggled to beat teams above 500, I don't think that's going to change this year. And so this is where the team building approach from Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel has not played out the way they expected. And again, the cost has come due and they have to pay that sooner rather than later.
Yeah, day one starters by necessity, right? It's kind of what we're looking at with some of these picks, with some of these teams. The next team in this group, the players that they took, I like the players that they took, but the way they took him, the process in which they took him, just screams desperate. And of course, we were talking about the Atlanta Falcons. As a Panthers fan, I love to see it. But they get Jalen Walker at pick 15. I think we can stomach that a bit more than it could have been at pick 8, right? I think putting him in that range is fair. They get James Pierce Jr. at pick 26 because they trade back into the first round. Good player, first round player, right? But I think both of those guys are going to have to start. And like I said, I don't want Jalen Walker to be a starting down lineman edge or even outside linebacker. I'd rather him be off of somebody. Then again, in the third and fourth round, 2 safeties. They needed the safety help. And then a tackle in the 7th round. So 5 total picks, 4 were defense. They needed defense, but it just came across as desperate, right? We're entering the 2nd year of Raheem Morris's coaching tenure, but year, I think 5 or 6 of GM Terry Fontenot's tenure. And with Fontenot, he hasn't seen like consistent results the entire time he's been there. Maybe I'm thinking or maybe he's thinking, oh, if this is my last ride, we got to go get 2 edge rushers, right? No matter what the cost is, just screw the first round pick next year. We got to go do this. And this is a team that isn't necessarily, I should say, a shoe-in for winning the division. I would think that they're like in competition for 2nd at this point. And so if Michael Penix doesn't show like really favorable growth, if Walker and Pierce struggle from the offset, this is going to be like a really, really bad offseason, especially for a team that didn't really add anybody in free agency. We talked about how the Cardinals added everybody. The Falcons didn't add anybody.
The Falcons are one of the biggest head-scratching cases. We're going to have a segment coming up in a few minutes where it's like, analytically, thumbs up. Like, but when it comes to like the evaluation process, it's like, what are you doing? And with Fontenot, like last year, we had seen teams over the past decade, Chiefs with Alex Smith, you take Patrick Mahomes, Eagles, Carson Wentz, you take Jalen Hurts in the 2nd. The Ravens, you have Joe Flacco, you still draft Lamar Jackson. Like all of these predecessors, obviously the Aaron Rodgers, the Jordan Love, we're still seeing how that transition's working out. But that idea of you have a veteran in the room and you draft a rookie to develop behind him. And so that's what Fontenot tried to do last year with Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix. Obviously, Kirk Cousins kind of fell off, and you're now riding with Michael Penix, but we only have a couple game sample size, so we don't know if he's going to be that dude. And then this year, you're doubling down at a position of need, but rookies don't perform in year 1 typically. And the 2 guys you drafted have some serious question marks. Like we were on record talking about Jalen Walker being undersized. Like, yes, does he have violent hands? Does he play with an insane motor? But if you aren't as big and fast as everybody else on the field, you're going to struggle to make plays, play in and play out. And then James Pierce on the other side, when we're going through this NFL evaluation process from the end of the NFL season to the draft, and he's a guy that goes from top 10 to falling out of almost the first round because of big character concerns. Yes, he has all the tools. Yes, he can be explosive. But if you can't get through to him as a coach and he can't play with you as a unit, like you just drafted 2 guys that have major question marks, one with all the intangibles you want off the field, and then one with all the measurables, but they aren't the same player. These are 2 separate players that you can't have on the field at the same time. Otherwise, it's a run liability. There's just so many things that do not make sense about this. Yes, are they good players in and of themselves? I just don't see how they work. And then you look at the 2 safeties they took. Xavier Watts, I think is good, but Billy Bowman out of Oklahoma, undersized. But this is what the Falcons have done over the past 10, 15 years. They get these undersized defensive linemen, and then they wonder why people are able to just smash them in their mouth and bully them from like the play 1 to the end of the game. And it's just, I don't get it. But again, the Falcons suck. They're a division rival. I could care less. It's head scratching. And I don't think Terry Fontenot is going to have a job for much longer if he keeps doing stuff like this.
For sure. It's funny that both of the edge rushers they took in the first round are Charlotte area guys. Jalen Walker is from Salisbury, about an hour and a half up the road, and then James Pierce is actually from Charlotte. And they were talking about, oh, the Panthers passed on both of us. I'm going to be happy to make them pay for it. I don't think either of them are getting past Taylor Moton, much less Ike Ekwonu, who's much bigger and stronger. So we'll have to see how
they're going to get
absolutely
mauled.
Yeah. And you know who emphasized the run game this offseason? The Carolina Panthers. The third team that was quite desperate. And this was my worst process out of all the teams. Maybe the Browns, but I thought the Lions process was really rough. We talked about it a bit on Tuesday. Yeah, we did, with Isaac Tesla, them trading essentially using 3 third-round picks to take this guy that probably would have been there in the 4th or 5th round. And because he's going to a system that has so many great pass catchers already, how much can you expect to get out of him immediately when the expectation should be high, because you're using what amounts to like an early 2nd-round pick to take this guy, or a late 1st if you look at like trade value charts. That's confusing to me. And then Tyreek Williams, I didn't foresee him being a 1st-round pick either. Maybe before his pro day where he injured his knee, but even then I thought this was closer to top 50 than top 25 guy. And the Lions felt the need to select him. Where did they pick? 27 or 28 or something like that. Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher with that one.
The Tyreek Williams selection, obviously, like, he shores up your run defense. I think he's going to be a good addition next to Liam McNeil. But again, passing offense dictates wins a lot more than a rush offense. And I understand maybe you want, from like a schematic standpoint, the ability to drop 7 in the coverage more often. But to me, finding a pass rusher would have been a lot more conducive there. Donovan
Right.
Ezeruko was there, and I thought that would have been more value. And again, it's not that edge is more valuable than defensive linemen. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I thought Walter Nolan and Derek Harmon provided more value than some edge rushers. But in that case and scenario, like you said, this guy was closer to a top 50 prospect than a top 25 prospect. And just that felt like a reach. Isaac Tesla felt like a reach in the 3rd round. And I really left out of their top 100 picks. The only one that I felt really good about was Tate Ratledge, who obviously reinforces the trenches, and that stays true to their identity with Brad Holmes. So if Tyreek Williams ends up being like another, like a good interior defensive lineman that gets a 2nd contract that would be in the range of today around like 15 to 20 mil a year, then I think it's worth it. It's just, it felt a little rich. And this consistently seems to be a theme with Detroit Lions drafts, but then the players pan out. So again, we'll hold off the judgment until we see these players play. It was just from a process standpoint, there was a lot to be desired. Now, a team you brought up that I think is fitting to talk about now, that probably is right there with them in terms of just like, he really didn't like the draft process, is the Cleveland Browns. Like, you pass up probably one of the 3 elite, well, I would say 2 elite talents. Cam Ward was just the best quarterback in this class, so he gets bumped in that like 3 picks that we saw come off the board. But you're passing up a Travis Hunter for a guy that's going to stop the run. And we just talked about this. The passing offense is more influential to winning games than running the ball. And for me, what Mason Graham signals is, hey, we got to stop teams from running the ball. Not, we need to get more explosive on the offensive side, especially for whoever the quarterback ends up being out of the 5 guys they're trying out right now for them. So that seems to be kind of the disparity for me talking about this next team with the Cleveland Browns. Is I don't think they're truly valuing the proper way of building the team. But again, getting a future first with next year's draft class being quarterback heavy, that may be the pivot point from the Deshaun Watson mess.
For sure, but then why'd you draft 2 QBs this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if Shedeur Sanders was going to end up on your team, and I think he's got a good shot of making the roster like top 2 or 3 QB, I think pairing him with Travis Hunter, somebody who has a connection with, wouldn't be the worst idea. But instead, they go with Mason Graham. He can provide pass rush juice too, but I guess they wanted to fortify their front. But it wasn't just that. To me, it was taking 2 QBs, right? Taking Dylan Gabriel, number 1. I didn't think he should be like a top 150 pick. And then doubling down on running back as well. With they only had 7 total picks because they traded up for Shedeur Sanders. And of those picks, we had 2 QBs, 2 running backs, a tight end in Harold Fannin, a linebacker in Carson Schlesinger, and then Mason Graham. So if you want to look at it from a premium position standpoint, 3 players, and 2 of them were QBs that, honestly probably aren't the best QBs currently on the roster. That's not even talking about Watson, who might not play this year with it was an ACL, right? Or an Achilles. Joe Flacco is probably the best QB on the roster right now. So I don't know why adding 2 rookie QBs seemed like a good idea. Seemed like there was owner meddling there, like too many ideas in the war room, and that's never a good thing. But then also doubling down on running back when you had so few picks, to me, is just questionable at best. And I like both of the players they took, and Judkins and Dylan Sampson. Is just like you didn't want to take an O-lineman, especially after the O-line fell quite poor, or was quite poor at the end of last year. Is not the O-line of 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know.
It's problematic when talking about this team with the Browns. Is there are so many holes on this team. This is not the 2018 Browns roster like you were alluding to, with a great offensive line, great defense, pieces on both sides of the ball. It's bare to the cupboards. This is the reason why they were picking top 3 in the draft, and you don't see a lot of areas where they necessarily improved. Like, yes, you're right. Judkins and Sampson, I think they offer that 1-2 punch that you were hoping to have had a couple years ago with Nick Chubb and Jerome
Ford.
Jerome Ford. Yeah, I was about to say Baker, and I'm like, nope, not Baker. So Jerome Ford, where you have that, I think that's what the replacement is. Harold Fannin, I like. Carson Swessinger, I like. Mason Graham, I like. Those 3 players in a bubble, apart from everything else, are really good players. I don't know how they're all going to fit together and work. And that's really, I think, going to be determinant of how this draft class pans out. But from the quarterback standpoint, taking that many quarterbacks, that many darts, it reminds me of the Panthers in 2010, when it's like you went Jimmy Clausen in the second round, you took Armani Edwards. I think you took another quarterback out of Cincinnati that year. You had another UDFA. It was just so many darts they threw at that position. And it feels the same way with the Browns this year. It's like you traded a draft pick for Kenny Pickett. You signed Joe Flacco again, who was on the team 2 years ago when you were doing this whole quarterback carousel. Then you draft 2 more dudes. And like you said, Dylan Gabriel in the top 100 picks, like, that's a head scratcher, but it is what it is. And the fact that you still add Shador, that was probably, like you said, owner pulling strings. It doesn't feel like anybody's on the same page between Andrew Berry, Kevin Stefanski, and Jimmy Haslam, the owner. And that's been the case with the Cleveland Browns. Like, that is the story of the Cleveland Browns. Like, they continue to just piss down their leg, and to no one else's fault. Like, there is no one else to blame outside of the Cleveland Browns. So they'll probably suck enough to where their pick will be the first overall pick, and they might have a top 15, top 20 pick from the Jacksonville Jaguars from this. So hopefully they're able to rebuild this. It's just, I don't know what else to say outside of bad teams just stay bad.
Yeah, how many wins did the 2010 Panthers have, by the way? So that's not
that's not
a group you want to be associated with when it comes to, our team looks a lot like theirs. But those were the desperate teams. There were teams that might have had good process, but the picks they made were questionable, right? I think about the Packers. They took Matthew Golden, first receiver since 2002, if I'm not mistaken, and they took Savion Williams, who's more of a gadget player. But I don't think Golden's a wide receiver 1. Maybe I'm a bit lower than other evaluators, but when you add, in my opinion, 2 like wide receiver 2s and 3s to a room that has like 5 wide receiver 2s and 3s, doesn't seem like the best usage there. I thought they could have gone defensive front a lot earlier than they did, but premium positions for sure throughout the draft. It's just like I didn't particularly like the players with each position.
The Packers, they typically make a lot of sense with their picks. They're addressing a need on the defensive side of the ball in the first round. They're taking best player availables, whether it's offensive linemen or wide receivers, or it could be an assortment of how they approach it. But Gutekunst has usually had a pretty succinct plan for approaching this. And exactly like what you said, they just seem to add more of what they already have. And this is where I think it comes back to their wild card loss and their playoff exit the year before in San Francisco, is when they start playing some of the heavier weights in the NFC, they don't have the star power. Like, who is that blue chip talent on either side of the ball for the Green Bay Packers? And to your credit, I don't think Matthew Golden or Savion Williams are player caliber enough to rise above and truly become an X factor. And that's just where I'm kind of at with the Green Bay Packers. It's just, you're going to be another 10-11 win team this year, and you're going to get bounced first or second round. And that's going to be that. And until they're able to look at themselves in the mirror and go trade for a star or really take a gamble on a player, like, You're going to take a guy like Matthew Golden. Yes. Is he clean in terms of how he runs his routes, in terms of catching the football, which he had an issue with that prior to his stretch last year. So that could be a problem. But you don't take a guy like Luther Burton that truly does have a potential X factor in him. It's like, that's the gamble you want to take at that pick. Like, stop trying to like hit the floor baseline that you have already in the wide receiver room. Go get that superstar. And they just did not approach the draft that way. So again, from a positional standpoint, from like, I guess, building the depth of the team, it wasn't a bad draft from an analytical process. But when you look at, I guess, the evaluations and the players they could have had at those spots, it was lackluster. There was something to be desired there. And I think it's very similar to the next team that we'll talk about, where they got some pieces, they collected some depth, but I really don't feel like they moved the needle.
Yeah, and that's going to be the Saints, right? I liked Kelvin Banks at 9. I really did. They needed the O-line help. I think both of us had them taking Membu, or maybe one of us had Banks at that point. Either way, they needed O-line help, right? Trevor Penning is just horrible. He never panned out. Ryan Ramczyk is officially retiring. He didn't play last year, but he's officially retiring now. So they know they need another tackle. So getting Banks is a good thing. He and their first-round pick from last year can be a good young tandem. After that, I liked Devin Neal, who was a 6th-round running back, and not much else in their entire draft. I'm outspoken about how I don't think Tyler Shuck is a sound bet in the league. I think he's going to be like a lesser Derek Carr. Like, I don't think he provides much upside, or doesn't have a ton of potential for growth. And then when you combine that with guys like Vernon Broughton, who I thought would be available later day 3, he was a 3rd-round pick. Jonas Sanker, a safety that we brought in, but I've been vocal about how I didn't think he was a fit for the Panthers. Glad the Saints took him in round 3 instead of like round 5, where I thought the Panthers could get him. Denny Stutzman, linebacker. He gets a lot of tackles, but that's about it. Quincy Riley from Louisville, probably limited nickel corner in the league. And you just read the list, go down the list, and it's like, none of these guys are, in my opinion, or on paper as prospects, none of these guys are like impact makers outside of Kelvin Banks, who has his own questions about if he's going to be a tackle or a guard at the next level. So when you had so many picks like the Saints did, and I'm counting up, they had 9 picks, and you only look at maybe one of them as being like a true difference maker in year 1 and throughout the duration of their rookie contract, just kind of rough to look at.
So when I look at the Saints draft class, and I think it's synonymous outside of what they did in the 2nd round, which we'll talk about Shuck in a moment, this draft class embodied just finding starters. And for me, I think you try Kelvin Banks at left tackle and you move Tylese Fuaga to the right side where he played at college. And hopefully you find your bookends. And if you have those 2 guys there, you can build around that. And I think that's the idea Kellen Moore has. With Jonas Sanker, Quincy Riley, you're just trying to get depth on that secondary that is getting a little bit older, that is still trying to replace some of the production loss from Marshawn Lattimore. That's where I think the direction is there, is that, hey, we're going to build some depth here. We're going to get some answers on the offensive side of the ball. But with Tyler Shuck, some people who watch the film and do some of these comps think he comps similar to a Derek Carr in terms of playing style, which if you don't have Derek Carr this year, or if he's limited due to injuries, you have Tyler Shuck. But Tyler Shuck also has an injury history, and just this whole New Orleans Saints team seems fragile, seems old, seems devoid of talent. And that's where, just in line with the Packers, while some of these picks in a vacuum, they weren't bad players. It's not like you aren't not adding talent to the roster. It's just, where are the difference makers? Who are the people that are going to take this team from being a bottom dweller to maybe an average team? And I just did not see that here with the Saints draft class. And another team, now I wouldn't say that they didn't not grab names, but a team that didn't address needs and may not see these players hit their full potential because of the other roster limitations are the Houston Texans. They're in a situation where they aren't able to get their guy in the 1st round, so they move back. And they take a Jaden Higgins. Okay, you get another big body wide receiver. You have some injuries with Tank Dell. You just lost Stephon Diggs, who you traded for. You traded for another wide receiver in Christian Kirk. And he's got an injury history. So I can understand addressing the wide receiver position. And then your next pick, you're going Ursary, who I think when you're rebuilding the offensive line, you at least have a lot of bodies in the room. Whether or not those bodies are actually going to pan out is another story. But that's a guy I think could be a contributor, especially early on. But then you go back to the well and get another wide receiver from an analytics premium position standpoint. Going wide receiver, offensive tackle, wide receiver is pretty solid. But you're going Jalen Noel, who kind of plays that Christian Kirk, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell slot kind of role to begin with. And it's like, I know you're throwing darts trying to find this answer, but if you're going to keep expending resources to answer the same problem, maybe you should address other issues rather than hammering that one point. And that's what I feel like with the Texans is they go, hey, we're trying to make sure that we have X, Y, and Z, and they completely forget about the other 23 letters or roster spots that they have on their team.
Yeah, for Jaden Higgins, I get it, right? Outside of McMillan, he's probably the next X receiver. And then there's not a lot of those guys left in this particular draft class, right? Ursary, good tackle. I think he could, if not start at right tackle, he could be one of the guard spots, right? But then back to Jalen Noel. It's not Noel. I keep making that mistake. But what does that say about Christian Kirk and Tank Dell? Are they going to be able to contribute this year? And then no other O-lineman. And I think we can all agree O-line was their biggest area of need, at least. Maybe they didn't like the value that they found with the other O-lineman, and that's okay. But for a team that 2 years ago had a rookie phenom with CJ Stroud, it looked like he was trending upwards, to last year where they had a bottom 10 offensive line. Stroud looked horrible toward the end of the season. They haven't done a lot to inspire confidence that they're putting out another good offensive line. And I think if I were a Texans fan, I would want more investment into the O-line. They brought people in, don't get me wrong, but the people they brought in were not very good. They were the Vikings pieces that the Vikings felt so good about not retaining them that they paid big money to replace Ed Ingram. They didn't bring back Cam Robinson, who was a flyer after Darisaw got hurt. So these are like the scraps from other teams that the Texans are attempting to work with. And I just think you would like to see them do a little bit more. But maybe both receivers turn out well. Even so, is the O-line going to be good enough for Stroud to stand tall long enough to get the ball to him?
And that will be the question. Are you going to have enough time in the pocket to get the ball to your playmakers on the outside? And I think when you look at the team building approach, I think what Nick Caserio is in essence doing is to amend what he did last year. And you in essence traded out of the first round, and that first round pick we'll talk about in just a second, but you get that second round pick after trading back. You use that to go get Stephon Diggs. He gets hurt. He's not even on the roster anymore. But your pick was the pick that selected Brian Thomas Jr. And it's like, if you had Brian Thomas Jr. and Nico Collins right now, this wouldn't be a question. But it was because you got a little bit greedy. You went, okay, we have the cap space. Let's go get a proven commodity. And it blew up in your face. So it's not always, hey, draft the next prospect, because we saw the Titans do that after trading A.J. Brown with Treylon Burks. Didn't work out. It's not always going to be beautiful, but sometimes taking those dart throws is a little bit better of a gamble and a risk than overpaying for a veteran who is aging. So I think they're doing that to amend for what happened last year. But if they had done the right thing then, we wouldn't be in this scenario where we're not so sure about the offensive line that's going to be trotting out week 1 in September. And that will put a lot more weight and burden on the defense and these pass catchers to kind of carry the load.
For sure. They might have jumped the gun a little bit on going for the Super Bowl window last offseason with trading for Diggs. And I think they brought in a new O-line coach, and that probably shifted how good the O-line played and that kind of thing. You mentioned the pass catchers. Obviously, the Texans doubled down on pass catchers, but with so many, or how should I say this, with so few impactful pass catchers at the top of the draft in this class and so few impactful corners and safeties in this class, there are a lot of teams that passed on them, and teams that have needs at those particular positions. Like the Panthers, yes, they grabbed probably the best receiver prospect in the class outside of Travis Hunter, but they neglected corner, which I think is a pretty big need, especially The starters, I think, are fine. It's the depth after the starters that I have questions about with the Panthers. And there were a couple teams that did that. You alluded to the Bills earlier, right? Brandon Beane, he's feeling himself. He went on the radio show and called people bums for wanting extra receivers on the team, even though if I had an MVP quarterback, I would want to keep giving him high-level receivers. You saw what happened with Cam Newton there. But they didn't get a receiver after maybe not having a true wide receiver one. And I think this was a theme across a couple of teams. Some of the teams we sung their praises earlier, but they didn't address particular outside needs on either side of the ball.
The Bills, Seahawks, Cowboys specifically didn't address pass catcher. We talked about the Cowboys earlier. They really had their eyes set on Tedero McMillan. He didn't fall. The rest is history. The Bills are an interesting case because what I want to point out, out of the past 20, 25 years, there is the GOAT, and then there's the guy chasing the GOAT. Who are those two guys?
Brady and Mahomes, I guess.
They've won a bunch of Super Bowls. And when you look at the 2010s, heck, you can even look at the 2000 Super Bowls, the 2020 Super Bowls that have been won by these quarterbacks. Outside of the year where Mahomes has Tyreek Hill, how many of these guys have this wide receiver one on the roster? There's not many of those rosters
Randy
that won a
Moss
Super Bowl.
Here. Oh, one is Super Bowl. Okay.
One is Super Bowl. I understand they went out and got Randy Moss, but then you're looking at, okay, so they address the way they build their roster a little bit differently than some of these other teams. And yes, we just saw the Eagles win the Super Bowl with all their pass catchers. We just saw the Bengals a couple of years ago go with theirs. That approach can get you to the big game, can win you. But when you look at some of these prolific quarterbacks, and to Brandon Beane's point, they haven't had these superstars on the perimeter. They've made it work with, in the case of Tom Brady, a Rob Gronkowski, in the case of Patrick Mahomes, a Travis Kelce. And so finding that weapon, and you do need it on the offense, I think is critical for Brandon Beane in that offense. But this whole discourse about you need wide receivers, no, the two guys that have won the most Super Bowls over the past 20, 25 years have not had these wide receivers. It is not necessary. And so I think what's interesting is when we talk about the Seattle Seahawks, they're a team outside of Jackson Smith and Jigba that really don't have any wide receivers. And so that's going to be very interesting to see what Clint Kubiak does in Seattle, especially with a guy like Jalen Milroe who can play a Taysom Hill role in his offense. So there's some neat things that we're going to see there. And then with the Dallas Cowboys under Brian Schottenheimer, we've seen him with the Jets and the Seahawks before, and they haven't prioritized the wide receiver position and gotten to the postseason. So I just want to put it out there that just because these teams aren't addressing the wide receiver doesn't mean that they can't go far in the postseason. That doesn't mean that you can't be a contender for a Super Bowl, because we've seen it with the best of the best quarterbacks that they don't need those guys to go win that big one.
I think comparing Brady and Mahomes to any other quarterback is a little bit disingenuous.
Josh Allen, I think, has a fair conversation with the case of Brandon Beane that he's an MVP quarterback now. He gets to get talked at least a little bit in terms of being close to that air. I understand Sam Darnold in Seattle, Dak Prescott in Dallas probably can't be put in that air. But Josh Allen with the Brandon Beane comments, I think, has the ability to elevate.
Josh Allen's an excellent quarterback, don't get me wrong. But when we saw in the AFC Championship when it wasn't a receiver that they were throwing to on all these fourth and shorts, it was him putting his body on the line, stuffed every single time except for one. And then you can argue one of them was they didn't have the right replay or whatever, even though on the field that was the pretty immediate call. But I just want good teams to get better pass catchers, I guess is my point. I would love to have Josh Allen get like Luther Burden. That would have been an excellent pick, like to see the upside of Burden and connecting with Josh Allen. We saw what Stephon Diggs was able to. Stephon Diggs unlocked Josh Allen. So I don't know. Maybe I want my quarterback getting a good weapon. I just think of Cam Newton after that MVP season, and it keeps coming back to me. Other side of the ball, secondary, particularly corners. We talked about the Panthers didn't address. The Falcons took two safeties, right? No corners. And AJ Terrell didn't have his best year last year. I think he's been on a downturn ever since he got paid. The Raiders, like the Raiders, their corners were already bad last year, and then they lose Nate Hobbs, who I think was their only plus corner. They lose Trayvon Merrick, who is their plus safety. So that's an area that's going to have to be looked at the start of the season, maybe in the third wave of free agency. Then the Dolphins as well. We talked about only two high-level picks before just a slew of like 5th, 6th, and 7th rounders. They took a couple guys in those rounds, but you can't expect them to contribute early in their rookie seasons, especially being day 3 picks.
No, the only players you should really expect being a starter or at least vying for that role is like a top 50 pick. And so you're exactly right. Is that your top 2 picks were addressing needs, and you still have more needs than those 2 positions. So the cornerback position for the Dolphins is looking dire. For the Panthers and the Falcons, they both, as like cornerback 2 going into the draft, they sign 2 players, 2 similar style contracts. For the Panthers, it was Mike Jackson. For the Falcons, I think it was Mike Hughes. And it was kind of like that $5 million a year kind of deal where it's just, hey, we need at least a floor for this cornerback room, depending on what happens in the draft. So there are a couple options in free agency still left for that second wave, and we'll see if those teams address those needs through there. But clearly it was not a position of need going into the draft. And I mean, for some of these teams, I think it is correct that you value the trenches more than you do some of these other positions. And because I think if you're able to kind of dictate what happens there, it allows everything else to kind of come into place from there. Where if you get some of these playmakers on the second level or skill position, they could be tearing it up. But if everything else is falling apart around them, you're not going to be able to see them make a play because they're kind of getting washed out for whatever reason.
For sure. I think we did a good summation about what we liked and didn't like about different draft classes and different styles. We're into takes territory now, and my take is going to be that we talked about a couple bad processes today, teams that made bad picks, that traded enormous amount of capital to do bad things, and 2 of the teams in particular, the Cleveland Browns, the New Orleans Saints. My take is that both of those teams will have top 5 picks in next year's NFL draft. So in the 2026 class, both of those guys are going to be hoping to get Arch Manning. Arch Manning's probably going to go back to school, so they might settle for another QB, but both of those teams are going to be top 5 pick teams.
So I like that. I like that those 2 will be the top 5. I'm torn between which general manager will be fired first. I'm not sure if it's going to be Terry Fontenot in Atlanta, but because that team has enough talent, I think they can hover around 500 in a bad division, vie for the NFC South title. And so I think at the very least, he'll make it to the end of the year with the team. A guy that I don't know is going to have as much favor. And it's just because, again, we've talked about kind of how they use their picks, and it felt desperate, and they still have a lot of holes on the roster, and it's not as talented as it once was a couple of years ago. The Miami Dolphins, I think, fired Chris Greer, and he becomes the first general manager fired kind of in this year, starting with 2025 going into 2026. So that's my perfect take. I think he's the first one that gets dismissed, and it's just because his team building process has been subpar, and now you're having to pay the toll. And their owner, he's up and down. We saw the Brian Flores situation play out. He chose Chris Greer, and it hasn't worked out. So we'll see if he continues with Mike McDaniel. I think that'll be the next domino that we talk about. If he is relieved of his duties, what ends up happening with him. But that's my perfect take. So I think that about wraps it up for us.
Yeah, and I think at least Fontenot has a young quarterback and be like, all right, let's give this guy a couple years, right, to see if he's anything. They don't.
He's on their rookie contract. Yeah.
They don't have that in Miami. Quinn Ewers, 7th round pick. Maybe that's the guy of the future. But I like that take. I think that's going to wrap it up for us. Over the next couple weeks, I think we're going to be a little bit spotty because Steve's going to be on vacation. But at least once the end of May kicks around, rolling back into June, that's when we'll get back into the swing of things. But until then, you can find us on Twitter, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your content. And keep pounding.